Welcome back to another deep dive into the twisted world of dark fantasy manhwa. Today we're exploring a story that takes the classic isekai formula and turns it into something much more sinister. This is the tale of Kang Hansu, an ordinary teenager whose life becomes a nightmare when divine intervention becomes divine abandonment. Picture this. You're a regular high school student living the most mundane existence imaginable. No secret powers, no mysterious birthmarks, no prophecies written about your destiny. You're just Kang Hansu, going through the motions of teenage life, attending classes, worrying about grades, maybe thinking about what to eat for lunch. Your biggest concern is probably an upcoming test, not whether you'll survive until tomorrow. This is where our story begins, in that deceptively calm moment before everything changes forever. Then, it happens. 1 second you're in your familiar classroom, surrounded by the chatter of your classmates, and the next second, reality itself seems to crack open. A blinding light engulfs everything, and when your vision clears, you're standing in an impossible place that defies everything you thought you knew about the world. Towering marble columns stretch toward a ceiling lost in golden mist, and the air itself seems to hum with otherworldly energy. Before you can even process what's happening, she appears. The goddess stands before you and your classmates, radiating in beauty so perfect it's almost painful to look at directly. Her voice carries the weight of cosmic authority as she explains your situation with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. You've been summoned, she announces, to save another world from an ancient evil known as the Demon King. The goddess weaves her tale with practiced ease, describing a realm where darkness threatens to consume everything. She speaks of the hero system, a divine mechanism that will grant incredible powers to chosen individuals. These heroes will receive her sacred blessings, transforming them from ordinary students into legendary warriors capable of facing unimaginable horrors. She promises that once the Demon King falls, all the heroes will be safely returned to their own world, their ordinary lives waiting for them, like nothing ever happened. Your classmates listen with a mixture of terror and growing excitement. Some are already imagining themselves wielding magical swords, casting powerful spells, becoming the protagonists of their own epic adventures. The goddess begins selecting her champions, and you watch as several of your peers step forward to receive their divine gifts. The chosen ones glow with newfound power, their eyes bright with the promise of heroic destiny. But something feels wrong to you. Maybe it's the way the goddess's smile never quite reaches her eyes, or the casual way she speaks about sending children into mortal danger. While others are caught up in the fantasy, you find yourself asking the uncomfortable questions. Why were you taken without consent? What gives her the right to drag teenagers into a war that isn't theirs? Why should you risk your life for a world you never chose to protect? Your voice cuts through the reverent silence as you voice these concerns. You're not being rebellious or heroic, just rational. You want answers, explanations, some acknowledgement that your life and choices matter. The other students look at you with shock, perhaps thinking you're ungrateful or foolish to question divine will. But you can't shake the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with this entire situation. The goddess's reaction is swift and telling. Her perfect features shift into something cold and dismissive. She looks at you like you're an insect that has somehow learned to speak, an annoyance to be dealt with quickly and efficiently. There's no anger in her expression, which somehow makes it worse. Anger would suggest you matter enough to provoke emotion. Instead, there's only indifference, the kind of casual cruelty that comes from absolute power, meeting absolute apathy. She waves her hand dismissively and declares that heroes require willing hearts. Since you've chosen to reject her generous offer, you'll receive nothing. No blessing courses through your veins, no magical system awakens in your mind, no divine protection surrounds your mortal flesh. You remain exactly what you were before, painfully, vulnerably human. As your classmates are guided away to begin their training under the protection of Prince Alsus, the Saint, and Princess Athena, Archmazing, you're left behind. These noble protectors will ensure the heroes are properly prepared, gradually introduced to their new reality with all the support and guidance divine champions deserve. Your former classmates disappear into golden light, transported to safety, comfort, and the beginning of their legendary journeys. You, however, are cast away like unwanted refuse. Reality tears open beneath your feet, and you're falling, tumbling through dimensional space until you crash into a very different kind of welcome. Instead of marble halls and divine protection, you awaken alone on the forest floor, surrounded by the twisted shadows of gnarled trees. The air here tastes of decay and something far more sinister. This isn't the safe introduction your classmates received. This is raw, unfiltered survival in a world that wants you dead. The forest around you pulses with malevolent life, and you can hear things moving in the darkness between the trees. Growls echo from multiple directions, suggesting you're not alone, and that whatever shares this space with you views your arrival as an opportunity rather than a coincidence. The betrayal is complete, and your real nightmare is just beginning. Surviving in this transformed world proves far more brutal than Kang Hansu initially anticipated. While others discover their newfound abilities and blessings, he finds himself completely powerless, struggling against creatures that seem designed to eliminate the weak. The forest becomes his personal nightmare, filled with monsters that hunt relentlessly and environmental hazards that test his every survival instinct. His first encounter with a beast nearly ends everything. A wolf-like creature, mutated beyond recognition, corners him near a stream. Without superhuman strength or magical abilities, Kang Hansu relies purely on human cunning. He fashions crude traps from branches and stones, using his knowledge of physics and engineering to create makeshift weapons. The battle lasts hours, leaving him bloodied and exhausted, but alive. This pattern repeats daily as he learns the harsh reality of his situation. During these desperate struggles, Kang Hansu observes other survivors from a distance. They grow stronger with each encounter, their bodies adapting and evolving through some mysterious system. He watches them level up, gaining new abilities and enhanced physical capabilities that make survival significantly easier. Meanwhile, his own body remains frustratingly human, vulnerable to every scratch and bruise that would barely affect the blessed individuals. The discovery of the blessing system comes through careful observation and stolen conversations. People speak of status windows, experience points, and divine gifts that enhance their capabilities. Some receive blessings of strength, others gain magical aptitudes, and many develop enhanced healing abilities that allow them to recover from injuries within hours. Kang Hansu attempts to access this system repeatedly, focusing his mind and trying every conceivable method to activate what should be his birthright as a transported human. Nothing happens. No status window appears, no divine voice speaks to him, and no power flows through his body. While others celebrate their growing strength, he realizes something fundamentally different about his situation. The world that embraces everyone else has somehow rejected him completely. The revelation comes during a particularly desperate night when infection from a monster wound threatens his life. As fever clouds his mind and death seems inevitable, an unexpected presence makes contact. Unlike the warm, encouraging voice others describe from their patron gods, this entity radiates uncertainty and confusion. The god of the excluded speaks with hesitation, explaining concepts that shatter Kang Hansu's understanding of his situation. He learns that the goddess who orchestrated this mass transportation never intended for excluded individuals to exist. Her system was designed to empower heroes, not create outcasts who fall through the cracks of divine planning. An excluded one, as the hesitant god explains, represents a fundamental error in the transportation process. These individuals receive no blessings, cannot access the leveling system, and remain bound by the limitations of their original human forms. The goddess expects them to die quickly, removing the anomaly from her carefully crafted world. Most excluded individuals perish within days, unable to compete with blessed survivors or the increasingly dangerous environment. The curse that prevents his growth operates on a divine level, actively blocking any attempt to gain power through conventional means. Even if he defeats monsters that would grant experience to others, the energy dissipates uselessly around him. His body cannot absorb the mystical forces that strengthen everyone else, leaving him perpetually weak in a world that rewards only the powerful. The god of the excluded admits uncertainty about why certain individuals fall outside the system. The entity seems almost apologetic, explaining that it never chose to become patron of the rejected. This divine being inherited the excluded by default, gathering those who had nowhere else to turn in a world designed to forget them. Understanding his true position changes everything for Kang Hansu. The analytical mind that served him well in his previous life begins formulating new strategies. If the world operates on rules that exclude him, he must find ways to survive outside those rules entirely. Conventional wisdom about blessings and leveling becomes irrelevant when the system itself rejects your existence. His determination crystallizes during another near-death encounter with a pack of enhanced wolves. Trapped in a cave with limited supplies and wounds that refuse to heal quickly, Kang Hansu makes a crucial decision. He will not simply survive until the world accepts him, because it never will. Instead, he must forge his own path through intelligence, preparation, and an unwavering refusal to surrender to the goddess's expectations. The god of the excluded watches this transformation with growing interest, perhaps seeing something unexpected in this particular anomaly. As Kang Hansu crawls from the cave, barely alive but still breathing, the foundation for something unprecedented begins forming. The excluded one chooses to live. The wasteland stretched endlessly before Kang Hansu as he ventured deeper into this transformed world. Days of solitary survival had hardened his resolve, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited when he encountered his first group of human survivors. They appeared like mirages in the distance, 5 figures huddled around the remnants of a collapsed building. As Hansu approached, he could see their desperate state. Torn clothing, hollow eyes, and the unmistakable tremor of fear that marked those still adjusting to this new reality. These weren't seasoned survivors like himself, but ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. The group's leader, a middle-aged man with graying temples, stepped forward cautiously. His voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed too much horror in too little time. They had been trapped for days, he explained, surrounded by creatures that prowled the ruins at night. Their supplies were dwindling, and several members of their original party had already fallen to the monsters. Against his better judgment, something stirred within Hansu. Perhaps a remnant of his former humanity. He found himself agreeing to help them navigate through the dangerous territory ahead. His experience with the alien environment and combat tactics could mean the difference between their survival and certain death. For 3 days they traveled together. Hansu shared his knowledge freely, teaching them how to read the signs of approaching danger, which areas to avoid, and basic combat techniques that might save their lives. He distributed portions of his carefully rationed supplies and took the most dangerous watches during their rest periods. The group began to look at him with something approaching reverence. Here was someone who moved through this hellscape with confidence, who seemed to understand the rules of their new existence. But admiration, Hansu would soon learn, could quickly transform into something far more sinister. It started with hushed conversations that ceased whenever he approached. Sideways glances that lingered too long. The subtle repositioning that left him isolated from the group during their brief moments of rest. His heightened senses, sharpened by constant survival, picked up on these changes even as he tried to dismiss them as paranoia. The revelation came during what should have been a moment of triumph. They had successfully navigated past a nest of particularly vicious creatures, and the group's spirits were higher than they had been since their first meeting. As they settled in for the night in what appeared to be a secure location, Hansu allowed himself a rare moment of relaxation. That was when they struck. The attack came from behind, swift and coordinated. A blade intended for his neck missed by mere inches as his reflexes, honed by days of constant vigilance, kicked in. As he spun to face his attackers, the truth hit him harder than any physical blow could have. These people he had protected, fed, and guided to safety were now trying to murder him in cold blood. Their reasoning, spilled out in desperate justifications as they pressed their attack, was as predictable as it was infuriating. His supplies were too valuable to share. His knowledge made him dangerous. His calm competence in this chaotic world marked him as somehow unnatural, possibly aligned with the very forces that had destroyed their previous lives. Fear and greed had transformed gratitude into homicidal intent. The fight was brutally brief. These were ordinary people attempting to ambush someone who had already adapted to a world where hesitation meant death. Hansu's response was methodical, efficient, and utterly without mercy. Each strike was calculated not just to defend himself, but to ensure that none of his attackers would rise again. When the violence ended, 5 bodies lay scattered around their makeshift camp. The silence that followed was more profound than any he had experienced in the wasteland. This wasn't the aftermath of defending himself against mindless monsters. This was the result of human choice, human malice, human betrayal. Standing among the corpses of those he had tried to save, Hansu felt something fundamental shift within himself. The last vestiges of the person he had been in the previous world crumbled away like ancient stone. These weren't isolated criminals or desperate outliers. These were ordinary people who had made a calculated decision to repay kindness with murder. If humans could transform so readily into predators, if mercy was met with violence, if trust was rewarded with betrayal, then the old rules no longer applied. The gods had abandoned this world to chaos, and the survivors had chosen to embrace the worst aspects of that chaos. Moving forward, there would be no more naive compassion, no more foolish trust in human nature. The wasteland had taught him that monsters came in many forms, and some of the most dangerous ones walked on 2 legs and spoke familiar words. From this moment forward, his survival would depend on assuming the worst about everyone he encountered, because in this new world, that assumption would usually prove correct. The wasteland stretched endlessly before King Hansu, but he no longer saw it as the barren hellscape that had once terrified him. Now it was a hunting ground, and he was the apex predator stalking through its depths. The creatures that emerged from the shadows were unlike anything that should exist in any realm, their forms twisted and alien, their very presence seeming to warp reality around them. The first gnoll materialized without warning, its body a writhing mass of void that seemed to consume light itself. Most would have fled in terror, but Kang Hansu stepped forward with calculated precision. His movements had evolved beyond mere martial technique into something primal and efficient. When his fist connected with the creature's core, the impact sent shockwaves through dimensions, and as the null collapsed into dissipating darkness, he felt that familiar pull toward its remains. The meat was unlike anything he had consumed before. Where previous monster flesh had been merely sustenance, this was transformation itself. As he swallowed, his body convulsed with violent spasms, every cell screaming as it was torn apart and rebuilt. His bones cracked and reformed, his muscles shredded and regrew stronger, and his organs shifted and adapted to accommodate power that no mortal frame was designed to contain. But something else was happening, something that made even Kang Hansu pause in growing unease. Each time his body broke down from consuming these otherworldly beings, it didn't just heal, it improved. When his spine snapped from channeling too much energy, it regrew as something harder than steel. When his heart burst from the strain of superhuman circulation, a new one formed that could pump liquid fire through his veins without missing a beat. The regeneration was becoming automatic, instantaneous, and increasingly divorced from natural law. He would watch in fascination and horror as severed limbs reattached themselves mid-combat, as punctured lungs sealed while he continued breathing, as his very flesh seemed to remember every injury and prepare countermeasures for the next encounter. Pain had become meaningless, death impossible, and the line between human and monster was blurring beyond recognition. It was during his battle with a particularly massive null that he first understood the true nature of what was happening to him. As the creature's acidic tendrils dissolved his skin down to the bone, he felt something else observing the spectacle. Not the monsters, not other survivors, but something far more ancient and powerful. Eyes that existed beyond physical space were watching him with what he could only describe as divine terror. The realization struck him like lightning. He had somehow acquired what the system called the blessing of the excluded, a power that existed outside the carefully constructed hierarchy of gods and mortals. While others gained strength through predetermined paths and divine approval, his abilities came from a source that the deities themselves feared to acknowledge. He was becoming something that challenged the very foundation of their cosmic order. The infinite regeneration loop was no accident, no glitch in some divine system. It was the manifestation of power that refused to be contained by the rules that govern life and death. Every time his body destroyed itself, it came back wrong, stronger, more alien. His reflexes had accelerated beyond human comprehension. His strength had grown to levels that could reshape landscapes, and his endurance had become literally infinite. Standing over the dissolving remains of his latest kill, Kang Hansu caught his reflection in a pool of the creature's blood. What looked back at him was still recognizably human, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The warmth of mortality had been replaced by something cold and calculating, a predatory intelligence that viewed the world as nothing more than resources to be consumed and obstacles to be eliminated. He could feel the gods watching him still, their attention a weight that pressed against reality itself. They understood what he was becoming better than he did, and their fear was palpable. He was no longer subject to their whims or bound by their limitations. The very power that sustained their reign was becoming irrelevant in the face of what he represented. As he continued deeper into territories where even the strongest monsters feared to venture, a new understanding crystallized in his transformed mind. The world that had abandoned him, the people who had failed to save him, the gods who had allowed such suffering to exist, they all shared responsibility for what he had become. They had created the circumstances that forged him into this unnatural existence, and now they would face the consequences. The decision formed with the same inevitable certainty as his regeneration. Revenge was no longer just a desire, it was his purpose, his nature, his very reason for existing. The world would learn that creating monsters came with a price, and Kang Hansu intended to collect that debt in full. When Kang Hansu finally emerged from the depths of that hellish realm, the world above had already begun to fracture. Civilization teetered on the edge of collapse, with survivors clinging to whatever alliances they could forge. But his return brought no relief, no salvation that anyone had hoped for. Instead, it marked the beginning of something far more complicated and terrifying. The conflicts that erupted weren't simple battles between good and evil. Humans found themselves caught between supernatural forces they couldn't comprehend, while otherworldly beings pursued their own mysterious agendas. Trust became a luxury nobody could afford, and betrayal lurked behind every desperate alliance. In this chaos, Kang Hansu moved like a force of nature, neither fully aligned with any faction nor completely opposed to them. What made these conflicts so devastating wasn't just the violence itself, but the impossible choices they forced upon everyone involved. Kang Hansu faced situations where saving one group meant condemning another, where mercy could lead to greater suffering, and where the very act of survival demanded actions that would have been unthinkable in the world that once was. The moral compass that might have guided someone else had long since shattered under the weight of his experiences. The mass violence that followed wasn't born from malice or hatred, but from the brutal mathematics of a world where resources were scarce, and death was always one mistake away. Kang Hansu found himself at the center of these conflicts, not as a leader or a hero, but as someone whose very presence altered the balance of power. His abilities made him invaluable to some and a threat to others, creating a web of alliances and enmities that shifted with each passing day. Yet even as he saved countless lives, pulling people back from the brink of extinction, those same people couldn't help but fear him. They saw the efficiency with which he dealt with threats, the coldness in his eyes when making life and death decisions, and the way he seemed to calculate human lives like numbers on a ledger. He had become something beyond their understanding, something that existed in the space between protector and predator. The fairy conflicts added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. These beings operated by rules and motivations that humans could barely comprehend, yet their actions had very real consequences for the survivors trying to rebuild their world. Kang Hansu navigated these supernatural politics with the same ruthless pragmatism he applied to everything else, making deals and breaking them as circumstances demanded. As the dust settled from these conflicts, one thing became clear. There were no heroes in this story. There were only survivors, each carrying the weight of what they'd done to stay alive. Kang Hansu had long ago stopped pretending that his actions could be justified by noble intentions. He chose survival over morality, effectiveness over righteousness, and accepted the isolation that came with these choices. The cost of staying alive had been everything that once made life worth living. He had sacrificed his connections to other people, his ability to trust, and perhaps most importantly, his belief that there was still something worth saving in the world. Every person he rescued looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and terror, seeing not a savior, but a reminder of how far humanity had fallen. In those final moments of reckoning, Kang Hansu found himself rejecting everything that had once given structure to the world. The gods who had allowed such suffering to exist, the heroes who had failed when they were needed most, and the systems that had proven so fragile when put to the test. He stood alone, accountable only to himself and the harsh realities of survival. The world that emerged from these conflicts would continue to exist, but it would always carry the scars of what had happened. And somewhere in that wounded landscape, Kang Hansu would continue to walk his solitary path, neither fully part of the world he had helped preserve nor completely separate from it. As he disappeared into the distance, leaving behind another scene of devastation and salvation intertwined, the survivors were left to grapple with a disturbing question. They had witnessed someone who could save them from any threat, who possessed the strength to reshape reality itself, but whose very existence challenged everything they thought they knew about humanity. The fear in their eyes wasn't just about what he might do, but about what he represented. In a world that had stripped away every illusion and comfortable lie, Kang Hansu stood as a mirror reflecting humanity's capacity for both salvation and damnation. Walking away from it all, carrying the weight of countless lives saved and lost, one question lingered in the silence he left behind. After everything he had endured, everything he had done, was there anything recognizably human left in him at all?